February 8, 1943. In the town square of Bosanska Krupa, a makeshift gallows stood against the gray winter sky. A rope hung ready. German soldiers formed a perimeter while townspeople were forced to watch. At the center of it all stood a girl, 17 years old. Her hands were bound behind her back. Her face was bruised, her coat torn at the shoulder, but her posture was steady. An officer stepped forward one last time, offering her life in exchange for names. She looked at him without flinching, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the square. It was the voice of someone who had already made peace with what came next. Lepa Radić should have been finishing school. She should have been thinking about dances, or summer visits to relatives, or what she might study when the war ended. Instead, she became one of the youngest and most defiant symbols of Yugoslav resistance. Her story is not just about what she did in the forests of Bosnia, but about the clarity that some people find when everything around them collapses. It is about choosing loyalty over survival, and about how a teenager became a legend in the 2 years between occupation and execution. This is the story of a girl who refused to betray her people, even when standing above a noose. None of the soldiers watching that morning could have known what they were about to witness, or that the execution they thought would break resistance would instead ignite it. Lepa Radić was born in 1925 in the village of Gosnica in northwestern Bosnia. It was a rural place, quiet and poor, where families survived on small farms and everyone knew everyone. Her father worked the land. Her mother managed the household. Lepa was one of several children, bright and stubborn, the kind of girl who asked questions adults did not always want to answer. She attended the village school until money ran out, which was common in that part of Yugoslavia. Her childhood was unremarkable in most ways, except for one detail. She grew up watching her country fracture along ethnic and political lines, and she learned early that silence could be as dangerous as action. When Germany invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941, the country did not just fall. It shattered. The Axis powers divided the territory among themselves and their collaborators. Croatia became a puppet state under the fascist Ustaše regime, which immediately began a campaign of terror against Serbs, Jews, Roma, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. Bosnia, where Lepa lived, became part of this nightmare. Villages were burned. Families were dragged from their homes. Deportations began within weeks. The Ustaše did not distinguish between combatants and civilians. If you were Serb, or communist, or simply in the wrong place, you could disappear. Lepa watched her village change. Neighbors turned on neighbors. People stopped speaking openly. The first deportations happened in the summer of 1941, when trucks arrived, and families were loaded into them without explanation. Some never returned. Others came back weeks later, hollow-eyed and silent. Lepa was 16 years old when she saw a woman she had known her entire life beaten in the street for refusing to leave her home. The woman was dragged away. Lepa stood with the other villagers, watching, and something calcified inside her. She did not scream or cry. She went home and asked her older brother, who had already joined the Partisans, how she could help. The Yugoslav Partisans were a resistance movement led by Josip Broz Tito, a communist organizer who understood that the only way to fight a genocidal occupation was to unite people across ethnic and religious lines. The Partisans were Serbs, Croats, Muslims, communists, monarchists, farmers, students, and deserters. They operated out of the forests and mountains, conducting sabotage, ambushes, and intelligence operations. They were poorly armed, often starving, and hunted relentlessly by German, Italian, and Ustaše forces. They also accepted women into their ranks, which was almost unheard of in 1940s Europe. Lepa Radić became one of those women. At first, her role was small. She carried messages between partisan units, moving through forests and villages where German patrols were less likely to stop a teenage girl. She learned to walk with her head down, to memorize routes, to lie convincingly when questioned. She wore her red partisan scarf hidden beneath her coat, adjusting it constantly, a small gesture that reminded her of who she was even when she had to pretend otherwise. The scarf was not just cloth, it was identity. It was refusal to disappear. By late 1941, Lepa had proven herself reliable. She was promoted to courier and organizer, responsible for coordinating supply drops, recruitment, and communication between scattered partisan cells. This was dangerous work. German forces had begun systematic sweeps through the forests, using collaborators and informants to identify resistance networks. Partisans were often betrayed by people they trusted. Captured fighters were tortured for information, then executed in public as a warning. Lepa knew all of this. What she did not know yet was that German intelligence had begun tracking a young female courier operating near Prijedor, and they were getting closer. She moved constantly, sleeping in barns, caves, and safe houses. She learned to read the forest, to recognize the sound of German vehicles from a distance, to hide documents in the lining of her coat. She also learned to live with fear, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that sharpens every decision. Every knock on a door could be a trap. Every stranger could be an informant. Every mission could be her last. One night in the winter of 1942, Lepa was carrying intelligence reports through the forest near Prijedor when she heard voices ahead. German patrol. She dropped to the ground, pressing herself into the frozen leaves, and waited. The voices grew louder. Boots crunched through snow. A flashlight beam swept the trees. She did not move. She barely breathed. The patrol passed within 10 meters of where she lay. When the voices faded, she stood, brushed the frost from her coat, and adjusted the red scarf beneath it. Then she kept walking. In November 1942, Lepa was assigned to help coordinate a sabotage operation targeting a rail line used to transport Axis troops and supplies through northwestern Bosnia. The plan required precision. Explosives had to be placed at a specific bridge support, while German guards patrolled both ends of the track. Lepa's job was to deliver the detonators and relay the timing to the sabotage team. She arrived at the rendezvous point, a burned-out barn 2 kilometers from the rail line, carrying the components hidden in a flour sack. The team assembled the charges in silence, working by moonlight. Lepa watched the tree line, listening for engines or voices. When the explosives were ready, she guided 2 partisans through the forest to the edge of the tracks, where they crawled forward under cover of darkness. The blast came at 2:47 a.m., a low thump followed by the screech of collapsing metal. The bridge support buckled. 2 days later, German reprisal squads burned 3 nearby villages in retaliation, killing dozens of civilians. Lepa heard the news from a courier and said nothing, but her hands shook for hours afterward. The operation was a success, but it came with a cost she had not anticipated, and the Germans were now hunting the network with renewed fury. By early 1943, Lepa had become one of the most trusted organizers in her region. She was 17 years old and responsible for dozens of lives. She knew the names of every courier, every safe house, every sympathizer who provided food or shelter. She also knew that this knowledge made her a target. German intelligence had begun focusing on capturing partisan organizers, not just fighters. They wanted the networks, the names, the infrastructure. They wanted to dismantle the resistance from the inside. The raid came in late January 1943. Lepa was meeting with a group of partisans in a forested area near Bosanska Krupa when German forces surrounded the position. Accounts differ on whether they were betrayed or simply unlucky, but the result was the same. The Germans opened fire. Several partisans were killed immediately. Others scattered into the forest. Lepa ran with 2 comrades, but they were cut off. One was shot. The other surrendered. Lepa tried to hide, but a German soldier found her crouched behind a fallen tree, her red scarf visible beneath her torn coat. She did not resist. She stood, raised her hands, and met his eyes. That small act of defiance would cost her everything. She was taken to a German command post in Bosanska Krupa, a town that had become a center of occupation forces in northwestern Bosnia. The interrogation began immediately. German officers needed names. They needed to know who else was in the network, where they were hiding, who was helping them. Lepa was exhausted, bruised from the capture, and frightened in a way she had not allowed herself to be before. But when they asked her to talk, she refused. Not with anger, not with theatrics. She simply said no. They asked again. She refused again. The officers were not used to this kind of resistance, especially from a teenage girl. They increased the pressure. They threatened her with execution. They told her she was wasting her life. They reminded her that she was young, that she could still have a future if she cooperated. Lepa adjusted the torn fabric of her coat where her scarf had been taken, as if the gesture itself could hold her together. She did not give them a single name. Historians are not certain how long the interrogation lasted. Some accounts say days, others suggest it was shorter. But what is clear is that Lepa Radić did not break. She was beaten. She was isolated. She was shown the gallows being built in the town square, a psychological tactic meant to make prisoners realize their fate was sealed. It did not work. She remained silent. On the morning of February 8, 1943, German forces brought Lepa and several other captured partisans to the square. Townspeople were ordered to attend. A crowd gathered, some out of fear, others out of morbid curiosity, and a few because they wanted to witness what defiance looked like. The gallows stood in the center of the square, crude but functional. Lepa was led forward. Her hands were tied. Her coat hung open. An officer stepped close and made one final offer. "Tell us the names, and you will live." Lepa Radić looked at him. She looked at the crowd. She looked at the rope. And then she spoke, her voice steady and clear. "I am not a traitor of my people. They will reveal themselves when they avenge us." It was not a plea. It was not a curse. It was a statement of fact, delivered by a girl who should have been in school, not standing on a platform with a noose around her neck. The German officer stepped back. The rope tightened. Lepa Radić died at the age of 17, having given up nothing. A photograph was taken moments before her execution. It shows a young woman with dark hair, her hands bound, a rope around her neck, her face calm. It is one of the most haunting images of World War II, not because it depicts violence, but because it captures something that should be impossible: dignity in the face of absolute terror. That photograph would later become a symbol of Yugoslav resistance, reproduced in textbooks, memorials, and museums across the former Yugoslavia. News of her execution spread quickly through partisan networks, carried by the same couriers she had once trained. Her refusal to betray her comrades became a rallying point. Other captured partisans invoked her example when they were interrogated. Resistance fighters painted her name on barn walls and whispered it in safe houses. The Germans had hoped that public executions would terrorize the population into submission. Instead, they created martyrs. After the war, Lepa Radić was named a People's Hero of Yugoslavia, the highest honor the country could bestow. Monuments were built in her name. Schools were named after her. Her story was taught to generations of Yugoslav children as an example of courage and loyalty. But in the decades since Yugoslavia's dissolution, her legacy has become more complicated. The country she fought for no longer exists. The unity she believed in fractured along the same ethnic lines that the partisans had tried to overcome. Her memory is claimed by different groups for different reasons, and the political context of her death is debated in ways she could not have imagined. What remains undisputed is this: Lepa Radić was 17 years old when she stood on that platform. She had been offered life in exchange for betrayal. That choice, made by a teenager in a Bosnian town square in the middle of winter, became one of the defining acts of resistance in World War II. Her story raises questions that transcend the specific context of Yugoslavia or the war itself. What does it mean to resist when resistance seems futile? What kind of courage does it take to refuse when refusal means death? Lepa Radić did not survive, but her story did. Carried forward by the same networks she helped build, remembered by the people she refused to betray. She was not a general or a politician. She was a girl from a poor village in Bosnia who decided that some things were worth dying for. She adjusted her red scarf one last time, not in fear, but in defiance, and walked toward a gallows with her head up. How many others made the same choice and were never remembered?